So since the start or the title of Lesson 9 is Control of Secretions and then Disorders, I thought that the best thing for us to do would first be to sum up what are all of the secretions, because we've written them down, they've been in your notes for the other lessons, but it's nice to have a list. What are all of the enzymes that I need to know about, and where are they coming from? So our goal today, once we take a few minutes to make this summary chart, will be to talk about what makes these enzymes be secreted, what is causing that to happen. And then the disorders part of it, we will actually do most of that next week. It's nice of you to show up. Should have brought breakfast for everybody. The disorders part we'll do next week, and I have some articles that I'm going to give you to read about your digestive system. So here is what I would like for you to make. It's a chart. I have 4 columns: digestive fluid, location, and I put origin and action, because I'd like you to know where things are coming from and where they are actually affecting your food. Then the third column is enzyme or secretion, and the last column is function. And you'll see I've listed 5 digestive fluids, and then I put a number next to each of them. This is how many things I would like for us to sum up that come out of that structure, that are part of that fluid. So there are 2 substances in saliva that I'd like for us to mention. 3 major ones in gastric juice that are involved with digestion and enzyme function. 4 from the intestinal juice, 5 from the pancreatic juice, and just 1 that is part of bile. That one's fairly easy. Bile is the only thing that's part of bile. The other ones all have other names, of course. All right. I'm going to show you what I would put in this chart. Since I'm the one making the test, this is probably what you should put in your chart too. I'm going to sum up digestive fluids. This doesn't mean I'm summing up every single thing that comes from this organ. So you'll notice that I'm purposefully leaving out hormones, because hormones go into your blood. That's a different thing altogether. We're talking here just about digestive fluids, things that are actually going to enter your digestive tract. Now your saliva, where does it come from? Its origin is your salivary glands. And where does it have its action? In your mouth. Now we could make the argument that that saliva continues to have an action in your esophagus as well, because it's not like the saliva stays in your mouth. But I'm putting mouth because that is the first place that it would start to have its action. Now there are 2 things that are produced in your mouth. Could anybody tell me one of these things? Sure. One of them is definitely salivary amylase. And the function of salivary amylase is to take polysaccharides and try to get them down to disaccharides, to break them up. Now there's something else that's part of your saliva that's not necessarily an enzyme, but that is important for digestion. Can anybody think of what this other thing is? 80% of you is made of this substance. You can float in it. Yes, it is water. Now, water is not an enzyme. Water is just a secretion. Water's job is that it is the actual thing that is accomplishing hydrolysis. So remember, salivary amylase is making the hydrolysis reaction faster. It's not actually doing it. So water is accomplishing all of these hydrolysis reactions. Now if we move on to your gastric juice, gast is the prefix for stomach. The origin of all of the fluids in your stomach is your gastric glands. And the action, of course, would happen in your stomach. Now there are going to be some enzymes, there's going to be a secretion here that I'm going to mention. The three things that I want to mention here are three things that help to digest foods. Does anyone want to take a stab at what one of the three things I want here is? Sure. Absolutely. That's an enzyme. It digests fats into glycerol and fatty acids. Now there are two other things, and the two other things that I want to put here kind of go together. Does anyone want to guess at what one of these other two things is? All right, you're on a roll, go for it. So we will put pepsin, and I will write ogen in brackets because pepsinogen is what is actually produced. And we know that it will become pepsin. This digests proteins into peptides. And the last thing that I think we should put in this category is HCl, gastric acid. Now that is not an enzyme, just like water is not an enzyme, but I'm putting it here because without this, pepsin doesn't work. So its job is that it activates pepsin. So we have our saliva, we have our gastric juice. Now is that everything that comes from the gastric glands? No, there are other things that are produced there. But in this chart, I wanted to include the substances that are actually helping to digest your food. So you'll notice I left out mucus and bicarbonate because those are protection things for your stomach. They're not actually part of digesting something. Was that what you were going to ask, Louise? Okay. Now, intestinal juice, where does it come from? So this is what your small intestines are producing. It comes from the cells between the villi, and it has its action throughout the length of your small intestine. Now you could call these cells brush border cells if you want, because that's what it looks like. They're on the edge of a hairbrush. There are four things that are produced here that we would have mentioned the other day. They are all enzymes, the ones that we're going to mention. So the enzymes that you have are maltase, which converts maltose to glucose and glucose. You have sucrase, which converts sucrose to glucose and fructose. You have lactase, which converts lactose to glucose and galactose. And lastly, you have peptidase, which takes peptides and converts them to amino acids. So all of those we had written down before, we are just summing up that they are part of this list of digestive secretions. Now we get to the pancreas, where quite frankly the most things are coming from. Remember that not only is your pancreas going to produce these enzymes, but it's also producing hormones. Your pancreas does a ton of things. Here, the origin would of course be your pancreas. The action, I'm going to write duodenum, which is the first section of your small intestine, because that is where your pancreas is attached to your small intestine. Now these enzymes could continue working the length of your small intestine, but I really wanted to focus on that is where your pancreas puts its secretions in your digestive tract. Now, in your pancreas, we are going to mention 4 enzymes and 1 other substance. We'll start with the 1 other substance. It produces a buffer. And you might ask, hey, you didn't mention the buffer when you talked about the stomach. Why are you mentioning it here? I'm mentioning it here because without this buffer, none of the enzymes that come from your pancreas would even work. They require a high pH, and what is coming out of your stomach is incredibly acidic. Without this buffer, none of the enzymes function. So the first of the enzymes we'll put is trypsin. It digests proteins into amino acids or peptides into amino acids, wherever we're at in digestion. We have amylase, which digests carbs into glucose. It could be a disaccharide, it could be a larger polysaccharide. It depends how much digestion has happened. We also have our fat digestion. So same as above, fats are getting digested into glycerol and fatty acids. And then the last one of the enzymes is nuclease. It digests nucleic acids. So those are the things that are coming out of your pancreas. Lastly, we have bile. Where is the origin of bile? Please make sure you note that your liver is the origin of your bile. Your gallbladder is just where it's stored. It's not where it's produced. Where does it have its action? Same as above. The duodenum, the first section of your small intestine, because that is where the common bile duct, which is attached to your pancreas, your liver, and your gallbladder, that's where it enters. The secretion, very simply, is bile. There's nothing else to it. And what does it do? It emulsifies fat. That is not chemical digestion, that is physical digestion, but it is still digestion, so it went on the chart. So when we talk about enzymes and the fluids that are necessary to digest your food, these enzymes are produced in specific cells, like your gastric glands or your salivary glands. And the appropriate enzyme is produced only when the cells are stimulated. There has to be a signal telling that cell, hey, salivary gland, it is time to make some saliva. Now, there are a few ways that stimulation could be provided. We will focus on some of the hormones because that gives us an actual specific substance to discuss. But there are others, nerve impulses and peristalsis, and most of the time it's a combination. So if I take a look at the chart on the right, this is a nice little summary of how each of the fluids is controlled. And then we are going to talk more specifically about the 3 that have a hormone involved. For your saliva, it is really your nervous system. Your thoughts, sights, smells. Your saliva is produced by what is going on in your brain. If you see food, if you think about food, if you smell food, saliva starts being produced. So I want you to think about something delicious right now. I'm going to think about dill pickle chips. There it is, saliva. I didn't even have to try very hard. So saliva is produced based on either the actual presence or the imagined presence of food. If you ever go to university and take a psychology class, you will hear about Pavlov's dogs. There's a guy, he's a psychologist, he was doing some experiments, and he did this one experiment where he would ring a bell every time he was going to feed his dog. And after a while, just ringing the bell made saliva be produced in the dog's mouth because the dog associated that bell with food. So thoughts of food or things that signify food. So for example, when you hear the bell ring for lunchtime, that probably unconsciously signals to your brain, hey, it's time for food. I'm hungry. So saliva is almost exclusively under the control of your nervous system. Gastric juice can be nervous, it can be hormonal, and it can also be because of peristalsis. So remember, peristalsis happens the length of your digestive tract. It starts in your esophagus, but there are muscles everywhere the length of that whole tract. What we mean by peristalsis here is really the presence of food. If you swallow something and food enters your stomach, that's a signal to your stomach that it needs to produce gastric juice. The same is true here when I say peristalsis for intestinal juice. When food enters your intestines, that stimulates the cells to produce these enzymes, and not before. That makes sense. What do you want enzymes for if there's no food there to digest? Now, like I said, the three that have a hormone involved, gastric juice, pancreatic juice, and bile, we'll do a separate little slide about them so I can talk to you a little bit more detail about what's happening. So before we do that, does anyone have any questions they want to ask here? Now, in your project, the story of the meal, one of the things at the end is the ways in which your meal stimulates your digestive system. This is what I'm asking about. So if you picked a cheeseburger, one of the things you could say would be the sight of the beautiful melted cheese signals to my brain and my mouth that saliva should start being made. That would be an example. So we'll talk about gastric juice. Please don't draw that picture on the right. I put it there because I wanted to illustrate something cool about your nervous system to you. Your gastric juice is controlled by a few things. Peristalsis, specifically stomach muscles. So as soon as food enters your stomach and your stomach muscles start moving the food around, that stimulates your gastric juice. The second thing is thoughts. Now, your body is connected by tons and tons of little nerves, but some of them are quite enormous. The vagus nerve is one of those. I'm going to show you your vagus nerve because all of those things are attached to your vagus nerve. So, your liver and gallbladder, your stomach, your intestine, your pancreas, your lungs, your heart. The vagus nerve is a very long nerve. They are not usually this long. This is one of the lengthier ones that you have. And this one nerve is attached to a whole bunch of your body systems. If you take Bio20E, there's a whole section on your nervous system where you would talk more about this. But basically, this vagus nerve is controlling a whole bunch of automatic functions. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention, like I said, was the hormone. When you have peristalsis, it will cause a hormone to be produced. So peristalsis is causing this hormone. This hormone will cause more gastric juice. The name of the hormone is gastrin. Now, is this the only hormone? No. This is the one that I want us to focus on. It's coming from your gastric gland, and it is going into your blood. And what does it do? It stimulates gastric juice to be produced. So not only is food present, and that's stimulating your gastric juice, you think about food, that stimulates your gastric juice, but when there is food present, now you have a hormone being released telling your stomach, hey, release HCl, release pepsin, release all the enzymes that you have so we can start digesting this food. So gastrin is a hormone. So now we have in our hormone category insulin, glucagon, gastrin. Does anyone want to ask any questions about gastric juice? So then the other hormones are involved with pancreatic juice and bile. For pancreatic juice, the stimulus for these hormones is food coming into your small intestine. So when food comes into your small intestine, the pH that's low, because it just came out of your stomach, causes hormones to be produced. Now those hormones are coming from your small intestine. There are two of them, secretin and pancreozymin. Now what do they do? Secretin causes the release of sodium bicarbonate. They both start with an S, secretin, sodium bicarbonate. That might be a way that you can remember it. The other one, pancreozymin, stimulates all of the enzymes. And pancreozymin has zyme in it like enzyme does, so that can be an association you could use to remember. So my pancreas isn't directly stimulated by food because no food goes there. But when food is in my small intestine, that makes a hormone. That hormone stimulates my pancreas. Now for bile, it's very similar, but this time it's fatty food. And it's entering the same spot, the duodenum, the first part of your small intestine. When fatty food is in your small intestine, your intestines release another hormone. Its actual name is cholecystokinin, but you can call it CCK. I will call it CCK as an abbreviation. CCK, just like any other hormone, goes into your blood, travels to your gallbladder, and tells your gallbladder to contract. And when that happens, bile that's in your gallbladder goes into your duodenum. So the other part of this and the last bit of notes on digestion will have to do with disorders. Before we do that, though, I'd like to do an example to show you an illustration of how homeostasis, once again, would be involved with your digestive system. There's a concept in biology called negative feedback. And what we'll do is we'll pick just one of the hormones, and I'll illustrate to you how negative feedback would work. Does anyone want to choose the hormone, or should I just choose it? All right, I'll choose it. I will choose CCK, cholecystokinin, the hormone produced in your small intestine that is stimulating your gallbladder. Now, the idea of negative feedback has two parts, the negative part and the feedback part. The idea is that substances will go back to the beginning and turn off the stimulus that was making that substance be produced. So, if we take CCK, for example, what was the stimulus? The stimulus was fat in the small intestine. That stimulates the production of CCK. CCK stimulates the release of bile. And for the negative part, bile will come back to the beginning and reduce the amount of fat that is in your small intestine. It's a loop. It's a little circle. Now, why is this an example of homeostasis? Your body is keeping a balance. You could make this little chart for any hormone or any enzyme that we mentioned today. The principle always being, once the hormone or the enzyme has done its job, the thing that was stimulating its production should be gone. And thus we should shut off production. So if I were to ask you about homeostasis for your digestive system, you could talk about insulin and glucagon regulating blood sugar. You could talk about the acid in the stomach and the buffers and bases maintaining pH. Or you could talk about negative feedback. All of those would be legitimate examples of homeostasis.